Why are some countries rich and others poor? This question has been at the center of economics right from the beginning. Adam Smith's famous work, which many people, although not everyone, regard as the first proper economics book, The Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations. Gaps between countries have always existed, but as late as 1700, when European countries started colonizing parts of the world, subjugating weaker nations and appropriating wealth from there, per capita income in the richest region of the world at the time, Western Europe, was only about 2.5 times that of the poorest region at the time, that is Africa. The economist Angus Maddison measured these incomes of different regions in the last 2,000 years in terms of what he calls the international dollar. As some of you know, this is a fictitious currency that tries to reflect the fact that when converted at the market exchange rates, different currencies actually buy different amounts of the same bundle of goods and services. There are a lot of untradeable services that people consume. So riding a taxi, eating in a restaurant, domestic servants, these kind of things are not internationally traded. So this means that countries with cheap services tend to have their living standards underestimated if you convert the incomes into market exchange rate, because market exchange rate is basically determined by things that are traded, mobile phones, TV, cars. So usually countries with cheap service labor, namely poor developing countries, and some rich countries that accept lots of cheap immigrant laborers like the United States and Singapore, they tend to have their living standard undervalued if their income is converted into market exchange rate. But of course, it's making big assumptions, because it's saying that everyone is basically consuming the same thing. Depending on the method of estimate, the figures can vary a lot. Forget exactly what year it was, but about a decade ago, the World Bank changed this method of estimating purchasing power parity income. And in one stroke, China's income fell by 43%, Singapore's income rose by 53%. So these are very kind of sensitive to the exact consumption basket. We are assuming that everyone is consuming all over the world, the exact method of estimation, the data you use. So you have to take this with a grain of, a pinch of salt. But these give you some ideas of the gaps between different countries. Going back to that comparison of the richest region and the poorest region of the world, if you use Maddison figures to look at the comparison in 2001, that is 300 years later, the respective per capita incomes of Western Europe and Africa gave us the ratio of 12.9 to 1. So the gap used to be 2.5 times, now it's 13 times. Incomes in international dollars is a good reflection of living standards, but in terms of a country's economic power, importance in the world economy, you have to use market exchange rate. These days people often use purchasing power parity income and say China is soon going to take over the US as the biggest economy. But that, I think, is very problematic, because in terms of weighing the importance of countries in the world economy, you have to use income at market exchange rate. Anyway, so if you use the market exchange rate incomes, the gap between the rich and the poor countries are even bigger. To give you the most extreme example, in 2010, Norway, which is the richest country in the world outside those small tax havens like Monaco, it had per capita income of $85,380 in 2010. In the same year, the poorest country in the world, Burundi, a small country in East Africa, had a per capita income of $160. So Norway was in market exchange rate income 534 times richer than Burundi. If you say compare the United States, which in that year had per capita income of $47,140, with Ethiopia, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, although it has been growing actually faster than China in the last 15 years. Ethiopia had per capita income of $380 in that year. So the US was 124 times richer than Ethiopia. So the gap is literally huge, however you look at it, and it has been increasing. So people have asked this question, why some countries have pulled ahead of the others and why some have fallen behind. The usual explanation, of course, is that rich countries have pursued better policies. They pursued free trade, free market policies. Developing countries didn't. They have basically fallen behind because they have used inferior policies. Exactly on the basis of this understanding of how countries become rich, the World Bank, the IMF, and many other multilateral institutions, as well as individual rich countries, have imposed what they think are better policies on developing countries. When they lend money to them, when they give foreign aid to them, they say, yeah, you can have this money, but you have to liberalize your trade. You want to borrow the money for emergency financial restructuring from the IMF? Yeah, fine, take the money, but you have to privatize half your state-owned enterprises. Even a quick look at economic history, however, shows that this interpretation cannot be further from the truth. Starting with 18th century Britain, down to South Korea and Taiwan in the late 20th century, virtually all of today's rich countries developed by using those bad policies that they tell the developing countries not to use. Until the 17th century, Britain was actually a backward economy dependent on export of raw materials. At the time, the high-tech manufacturing center of Europe was the Low Countries, what are Belgium and the Netherlands today. Why? Because at the time, the most high-tech industry in Europe was woolen manufacturing, manufacturing textile out of sheep's wool. And Britain was a supplier of that raw material. And then the British realized that this is not making them any richer. So over time, British kings tried to overcome this backwardness by promoting woolen manufacturing within Britain, by giving protection, by banning the export of wool to the Low Countries so that the raw materials in Britain would be cheaper, providing some subsidies. Kings like Edward III, Henry VII, Elizabeth I, they all used these policies to promote woolen manufacturing. But in the 18th century, there was a big shift in the overall British economic policy when Robert Walpole, commonly known as the first British Prime Minister, came to power. Now, Walpole is today known only for his corruption. Towards the end of his prime ministership, he was accused by a political opponent for becoming rich using his office. But Walpole's response was like, yes, I have held the most powerful post in the country for the last 20 years. It's very natural that I become rich through it. But you, sir, you only had a minor office, and you have become rich, so you are the one with the problem. Yes, so he was fantastically corrupt, but he was a very competent economic manager. He was brought to power in 1721 following the financial crisis of the time, the South Sea Bubble. Now, this South Sea Bubble was caused by a speculative frenzy surrounding this company called South Sea Company, which was set up by some Tory politicians and got a royal charter to give it limited liability. At the time, you had to actually have permission from the king to set up a limited liability company. So only very powerful and important companies like the East India Company got limited liability, which enabled them to mobilize capital on a large scale because you could sell the share to anyone. Now, the South Sea Company was set up ostensibly to trade with the South Sea, which at the time meant Latin America. But the company was a scam because at the time, Britain and Spain were at war almost all the time. So within 10 years of its existence, it sent only one trading ship to Latin America because most of the time the Spaniards said, no, you cannot come here. But in 1720, the relationship between Spain and Britain improved a bit, and the guys who were running South Sea Company started spreading all these rumors that, now we are going to set up a new colony and we are going to send 5 ships for trading next year and so on. And suddenly people thought, wow, this is a great opportunity. Within a year, share price increased by 9 times. Huge fortunes were made and lost. One of the people who made a huge fortune and lost all of it was Isaac Newton, the famous scientist, who apparently lamented that I can predict the movements of heavenly bodies, but I cannot predict human madness. No, Newton was not an innocent scientist. He was the head of Royal Mint, where they stamped coins for 30 years. He was quite a wheeler dealer. Anyway, but even he was tempted by this speculative frenzy, and in 1721 it all came tumbling down. Walpole was brought in because he was a very competent economic manager, so he sorted out the financial crisis, restructured the British tax system. But another important thing that he did was to introduce a range of trade and industrial policies to promote less developed British manufacturing industries against superior continental competitors. So he provided tariff protection for British industries, not just woolen manufacturing, but a range of industries, gave them subsidies, especially export subsidies, and even imposed government quality control over exports. Because the problem with made in England, made in somewhere brand is that all producers are treated equally. So if an unscrupulous producer produces sub-quality product, the whole country's brand is tarnished. So he said, no, we can't do that. The textile exporters have to have the quality check so they don't sully the name of made in England. Now, very interestingly, these are policies that were practiced by the so-called East Asian miracle economies 2.5 centuries later, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Some of the policies that I had thought were invented in Japan in the 1950s were actually invented by Robert Walpole and British policymakers at the time. But basically, between the time of Walpole and the 1850s, when Britain became the supreme world industrial power and didn't need these protections anymore, Britain was one of the most heavily protected economies in the world. If you look at this table, you will see that as late as 1820, Britain had the highest average industrial tariff in the world. Now, R here means that figures exist, but there are gaps and we cannot get the complete data. NA simply means that the data is not available. Also, there are other studies that estimate the tariff rate in countries like France, and I can tell you that at least in the case of France, the average tariff was much lower than in Britain. For most of the period covered by this table, countries that do not appear in this table were either colonies, which meant that they didn't have their independent tariff policy, or was subject to so-called unequal treaties that deprived them of many policy options, including the power to set their own tariffs. So these unequal treaties were originally introduced when the Latin American countries went independent in the 1810s and 20s. And basically the stronger countries in Europe came to Latin America and said, yes, now you're a country, but you are still not quite there. So for example, we are not going to let our citizens to be tried in your territory even if they commit crime there, because we don't believe in your court system. This is known as extraterritoriality. And they said that we are going to take away your right to set your own tariffs because that your administration is untrustworthy. So starting with that, I mean, country after country was subject to this. I mean, China was the subject to the so-called Nanjing Treaty in 1842 after the infamous Opium War. The Ottoman Empire had to sign this, Ethiopia had to sign this, Thailand, which then was called Siam. So you see that Britain, which allegedly invented free trade, was actually a country that invented protectionism, if you like. Friedrich List, the 19th century German economist, who is today commonly but mistakenly, as I'll tell you in detail later, known as the father of the so-called infant industry argument, condemned the British advocacy of free trade as an act of kicking away the ladder. The infant industry argument is the argument that the government of economically backward countries need to protect and nurture their young industries until they grow up and compete in the world market. List was a very strong advocate of this argument, but one of the things that he was doing was to point out the hypocrisy of British recommendation for free trade. Because he was saying, look, the British tell us, the Germans, the Americans, the backward nations, not to protect our industries or the free trade, but look at British history itself. How did it become rich? It became rich through protectionism. So Britain telling us not to use protectionism is like someone climbing up to the top with a ladder and kicking the ladder away so that other people cannot follow. I mean, you don't need to read this. It's all summarized in this cartoon on the cover of my 2002 book. It gets more interesting. If Britain was the first country to have succeeded by protecting immature industries against superior foreign competitors, the first country to have theorized the practice is the United States, another country that has allegedly developed on the basis of free trade. And the person who invented this theory is this guy, Alexander Hamilton, who you see on the $10 bill. Alexander Hamilton became the US Treasury Secretary at the outrageously young age of 33 in 1789. The US might have gone independent in 1776, but for 13 years, they actually didn't have the federal government. George Washington became the president in 1789. And Hamilton was appointed the Treasury Secretary. And 2 years after his appointment, he submitted this report called the Treasury Secretary's report on the subject of manufactures to the US Congress, in which he argued for a theory which is today known as the theory of infant industry protection. Now, the idea was very simple, a very powerful one. Now, in this book, I have a chapter called My 6-year-old Son Should Get a Job. I start by saying, I have a 6-year-old son. I don't use such a strong language in the book, but basically I say he's a parasite. I mean, he's totally dependent on me. Food, lodging, heating, education, TV, Nintendo games, you name it. So I got thinking, actually, if I stop sending him to school and send him to work, I can save a lot of money. I mean, why should I pay for this guy? And then I realized that this is a win-win situation. Because not only will I be saving a lot of money, but he will become a more productive person. Yeah? No more wasting time in front of TV, playing Nintendo games. He'll have to go out in the world, in order to survive the competition. He'll have to practice whatever trade he's prying. I don't know, shoe shining, chewing gum selling, you name it. Yeah. So it's a great idea, isn't it? Yeah? I mean, I save money, he becomes a better person. Well, why don't I do it? Well, I don't know about the other people, but the reason why I wouldn't do it, I said, was because, well, he's quite a clever guy. I think if I supported him for another, 12, maybe 15 years, he could become lots of things. I mean, he could become an architect. He could become a nuclear physicist. He could become a brain surgeon. So, I'm willing to make that investment. Of course, there's a good chance that this guy might turn out to be a total waste of time. He might be 33, unemployed, live with me. But I'm willing to take that chance. Because I know that if I send him to the labor market at the age of 6, what can he become? Okay, maybe if he's really lucky, he can own a small shop. But that's about it. He'll never be able to become a brain surgeon, never be able to become an architect. So this is, in a nutshell, the idea of infant industry protection. Of course, today, subsidizing these inefficient industries, protecting these inefficient industries is costly. Because actually you can import cheaper and better things from abroad, but you have to do it if you want these industries to become productive. If you want your economy to acquire the ability to grow some high-tech sectors in the future. But in recommending this infant industry protection for his young country, Hamilton was actually going against the greatest economic authority of the time, Adam Smith. He keeps coming up. In his Wealth of Nations, he was explicitly advising the Americans not to try to artificially develop manufacturing industries because it's bad for them. But Hamilton had the guts to say to Adam Smith, well, not personally, thank you, but no thank you. I know what is good for my country. Please go away. Of course, other Americans were totally unconvinced, especially Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton's political archenemy, said, look, don't be ridiculous. We can export our cotton and tobacco to Europe and import things that are not only better, but also cheaper. Why should we subsidize these inefficient Yankee manufacturers? We need free trade. Hamilton was, of course, a powerful guy, the number 2 to Washington. So the Congress said, yeah, we'll raise the tariff a little bit from 5% to 12%, but you're not going to get the 40, 50% that you have asked for. Hamilton, unfortunately, died rather young at the age of 49 in 1804 in a pistol duel where he was shot, and the guy who shot him dead was someone called Aaron Burr, the then serving vice president. These were wild days. Serving vice president shoots the ex-finance minister dead, and no one goes to prison. When Britain invaded the United States in 1812 in the Anglo-American War, the first and so far the last time when US mainland was invaded, people got a shock and realized unless they start manufacturing things, including weapons, they cannot defend their country. Unless they become richer with manufacturing, they cannot fight these wars. So a lot of people converted to Hamilton's ideas, and by the 1830s, it had one of the highest tariff rates in the world. And basically, until the Second World War, it remained one of the most protected economies in the world. Basically, industrial tariff in America fluctuated between 35 and 50% on average during this period. Today, average industrial tariff rate in developing countries is about 10%. Well, similar story applies to other rich countries of today. Most of them use these bad policies like protectionism when they needed them, and of course dropped them only when they didn't need them anymore. So when the US became the top dog, it started preaching free trade. Later, countries like Japan and South Korea developed on the basis of these policies. When they became rich, they started promoting the idea of free trade and openness to foreign direct investment. With a few exceptions, like the Netherlands and Switzerland until the First World War, all of today's rich countries used protectionism for substantial periods. Interestingly, countries like Britain and the US, which are known as the countries that invented free trade, were actually the most protectionist economies in the world in their respective catch-up periods. Germany, France, and Japan were actually much less protectionist than Britain or the US. Lots of countries had average tariff rate of 18%, 25%. I keep reminding you that today the average industrial tariff rate of developing countries is around 10%. So even until the 60s, these countries were protecting their industries more heavily than what developing countries are doing today. These days, for example, the developing countries are told that you should not try to regulate foreign direct investment because these are good for you. If you regulate them, investors wouldn't come. But when they were at the receiving end, today's rich countries very heavily regulated foreign direct investment. For example, in the 19th century, in the United States, foreign direct investments in finance, shipping, mining, and logging were very heavily regulated. At the time, actually, there wasn't a lot of foreign direct investment in manufacturing. It was mainly in services and finance and natural resource exploitation. And these were sectors that were heavily regulated. So especially in banking, only American citizens could become a director of a bank. And foreign shareholders were not even allowed to vote in the annual general shareholders meetings. Today, you go to Korea, you go to Mexico, there are a lot of foreigners who are the CEOs, not to speak of board members of major banks. Another example of kicking the ladder is that today, if you go to the WTO and these international organizations, the Japanese government regularly submits this document saying regulation of foreign direct investment is bad for economic development. Hello, what did you do when you were developing? You basically completely banned foreign direct investment. Finland classified all firms with more than 20% foreign ownership as dangerous enterprises. Finns are not exactly the subtlest people in the world, but this was quite heavy stuff even from the Finns. I haven't invented these words. These are official Finnish terms. Until the early 1980s, there was no foreign bank branch in Finland. In the early days of development, Germany and Japan used state-owned enterprises to kickstart industrialization in the key sectors. State-owned enterprises were extensively used in France, Finland, Austria, Norway, Taiwan, and Singapore. I already told you about Singapore in my first lecture on the nature of economics. 22% of GDP in Singapore is produced by state-owned enterprises. In Taiwan, 16% of GDP is from state-owned enterprises. All the French firms that you have ever heard of were either still significantly owned by the state or until recently were owned by the French state. It's actually quite amazing. Almost all sectors in which the US still has the international technological leadership are sectors that were created and promoted by the US military. Computer, internet, Google Maps, I mean, these were all based on technologies initially promoted by the Pentagon. Few people know this, but semiconductor, the sort of building blocks of the information economy, this was initially developed by the US Navy. The US would not have the leadership in aircraft industry without the subsidies and procurement from the US Air Forces. In the pharmaceutical and biotechnology, around 30% of research funding is given by the US federal government. If you just look at the statistics of state-owned enterprises, the US has a tiny state-owned enterprise sector accounting for only about 1% of GDP. So you might think, the US at the state doesn't really play an important role in the productive sector. But once you know, what it has done to promote the technologies, to establish new industries, you would not have that view. More recently, some neoclassical economists have broken away from this tradition of emphasizing economic policies as the explanation of intentional differences in the living standards, and have come to offer a huge range of unalterable factors as the explanation in the gap between rich and poor countries. They say tropical climate is holding back developing countries because it increases tropical diseases that reduce labor productivity. Tropical soil leads to low agricultural yield because it's quite poor in nutrients. Geography matters. A lot of African countries are landlocked, and this restricts their ability to trade. Many of them are in bad neighborhoods in the sense that the surrounding countries are poor, so there are fewer trading opportunities. They tend to be plagued by violent conflicts. Many of them have talked about the natural resource curse. Basically, the argument is that abundant natural resources lead to corruption, conflicts, and overvaluation of currency that harms the economy. They talked about ethnic diversity. Some people have emphasized that it's not all diversities that is a problem. It's a medium degree of diversity with 2, 3, 4 powerful groups. If you're like Tanzania with like 200 groups, it's very difficult to organize these groups into warring factions, so it's actually okay. Or if you're homogeneous like Korea, everyone, well, allegedly, that looks and thinks alike, so that's good. But if you have 2, 3 contending groups, it creates all kinds of conflicts. The argument by the Turkish economist Ajimulu that in many developing countries, the colonizers brought poor quality institutions because they had no intention of settling there, because they had too many diseases and therefore it was too dangerous to live there. So if they found places they could settle, like Australia or the United States, they brought good institutions from home. But if you're going into what DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo today, you wouldn't want that. That you can't be bothered with those because you are not going to live there. So you come in, you put in some basic institutions that will allow you to extract resources and get away. And this has persisted for the last few centuries, affecting the quality of institutions in those countries. Some people have even talked about developing countries having bad culture, poor work ethic, inability to save. Samuel Huntington, the author of the controversial book, The Clash of Civilizations, commenting on the fact that Ghana and South Korea in the early 1960s had similar levels of development. Basically, he's saying, well, Ghanaians had the wrong cultural values. South Koreans valued thrift, investment, hard work, education, organization, discipline. Ghanaians had different values, what is implying. Yeah? So these people are basically saying that developing countries are not developing because there's something wrong with them. It's not even policy. They are destined to fail. But when you take a closer look at these things, the arguments begin to fall apart. First of all these meta-structural factors have been more or less the same throughout, for example, Africa's post-independence period, but the continent's growth performance has fluctuated substantially. In the 60s and 70s, GDP per capita in sub-Saharan Africa was growing at an annual rate of 1 or 2%, and then it fell to minus 0.7% per year in the 80s and 90s. Since the 2000s, it has gone up to above 2%. If the meta-structural factors are the determining factors, economic growth in Africa should have stayed more or less the same all along. Also, individual country experiences counter the meta-structural arguments. Two of Africa's best growth performers, namely Ethiopia and Rwanda, are landlocked. Ethiopia had internal war, Eritrea split off in the 1990s, and Eritrea had all the coast. So Ethiopia suddenly became a landlocked country, and then it started growing faster. Uzbekistan is another interesting example. This is the only country that is double landlocked, meaning that you have to go through two countries before you get to the sea. Between 2004 and 2013, they were growing at 6.6% per year. That is the kind of growth rate that South Korea and Taiwan had during the miracle years. It used a very gradualist approach, still has a quite high protection and government intervention. So using the wrong policies, being doubly landlocked, you would think this will be a disaster zone. It's actually the best performing economy in the region, best performing ex-Soviet republic. The Scandinavian countries used to be landlocked half the time until they invented ice-breaking ships in the late 19th century. For 6 months, they had no access to sea. Also, these meta-structural factors have been present in today's developed countries. You say tropical climate is bad. How about Singapore? Canada, parts of the US, Scandinavia, they have Arctic and frigid climate. You think that makes economic development easy? No. You have to spend a lot of money just heating up places. Factories have to be heated because machines seize up. Even lubricants don't work well. The reason why tropical climate look bad for economic development is because the countries in the region are, for whatever other reason, poor, and they don't have the technologies to deal with it. A lot of the rich countries like southern Italy, southern US, they have summers that are hot enough for malaria. They used to have a lot of malaria. But they don't suffer from malaria these days because they have improved sanitation. Being landlocked, yes, Switzerland and Austria, two of the richest countries in the world, are landlocked. Resource curves, the US, Canada, Australia, they are very well endowed with natural resources. Actually, most African countries do not have a lot of natural resources. They seem like being richly endowed with natural resources only because their economy is underdeveloped and they rely on natural resource exports. But when you actually look at the data on deposits, these countries are not that well endowed except for DRC and South Africa. Switzerland, Belgium, and Taiwan have wrong degrees of ethnic divisions. Switzerland has basically three groups. German, French, Italian, and a small group that speaks Romansh. And indeed, in the 18th and 19th century, Switzerland had like 4 civil wars. It was never that peaceful. The original people of Taiwan are Polynesians. A tiny number of them still exist, called Kaoshan people. But the so-called Taiwanese are descendants of people who migrated from Southeast China in the 16th, 17th century, especially from Fujian province. But then superimposed on this group was the so-called mainlanders, the northerners who came with the Nationalist Party government when they were kicked out of mainland China by the communists. So once again, it's not as if rich countries do not have these ethnic divisions. They somehow built the political system made economic arrangements to make these containable. It's not that they don't have them. Yeah? In the early days of development, today's rich countries had institutions that are far worse than the African ones today. In terms of culture, before their economic successes, the Germans, the Japanese, and the Koreans, they were all described as lazy, overly emotional, uncooperative, and much worse. Yeah, so this is a comment by an English traveler in Germany in the early part of 19th century. Basically, he's saying the Germans are stupid. Yeah? Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein novel, in her travel journal, once wrote that Germans never hurry. They have no sense of time. Yeah? And then this is a comment that Beatrice Webb, one of the founders of Fabian socialism in this country, made when she went to Korea and met my ancestors. And I think this is one of the rudest things that anyone has ever said about anyone. 12 millions of dirty, degraded, sullen, lazy, and religious savages. Basically, one problem is that when you live in a kind of poor agrarian society, you don't need to keep time, for example. If you live in an industrial society, you have to keep time. If you are working in a production line, everyone has to be there at 8:35 so that the line can start. And in relative terms, time is more valuable. So people's behavior change. So in addition to this the inevitable prejudice that people from rich countries have towards poor people in poor countries, we have this the fundamental differences in the organization of societies that are due to the differences in economic structure. Even in Korea, until say 20 years ago, we had this expression called Korea time, which means that you can be up late for an appointment up to maybe 1.5 hours, and you don't have to apologize. That's what people do. Today, the expression doesn't even exist. Everyone's working to the clock. Everyone's busy. Societies are highly organized. People keep time. So all these so-called meta-structural factors, when you look at them closely, are very flimsy ones. The argument based on them are usually based on factual mistakes and blindness to history. More importantly, these meta-structure arguments fail to recognize that the rich countries appear not to suffer from those meta-structural factors, not because they don't have them, but because they have developed sufficient technological and organizational capabilities to deal with their harmful effects. Indeed, I would go even further and argue that these meta-structural arguments have become prominent only because the mainstream economists could not explain why the developing countries have done poorly since the 1980s, despite starting to use the good policies that they were recommending and the World Bank and the IMF were forcing on them. These are policies that are based on the best economic theories. So if the policy didn't work, there must be something wrong with the countries, not the policies. History shows that when they were developing countries themselves, almost all of today's rich countries used wrong policies, like trade protectionism, regulations of foreign direct investment, state-owned enterprises. Also, these policies have very respectable theories behind them, so it's not a fluke. Another important consideration is that these countries apply those theories in very pragmatic rather than dogmatic ways. So you get to see a lot of the totally unexpected combinations like Singapore or Sweden. Recognizing these basic facts is the starting point of our quest for the answer to the question that I started the lecture with: why are some countries rich and others poor.